Hello to everyone watching. Welcome to our video-based discussion. I am Matias Verdejo, and with my two partners, Aaron Núñez and Paulo Quezada, we will present you the topic of willingness to communicate. Without anything else to add, let's begin. To start off, we will list you the main objectives of this presentation. These are being capable of understanding the McIntyre et al. Model, relating willingness to communicate to Krashen's interactionist approach, recognizing the antecedents that can affect willingness to communicate, and forming your own opinion regarding the willingness to communicate versus willingness to participate dispute.
Now, as a warm-up activity, we will introduce you to the next three questions. Have you felt anxious in class when prompted to speak up? Do you know why? How do you feel when someone speaks English more fluently than you? Do you think your proficiency in English affects your willingness to communicate? How much? Now, to entirely introduce you to the topic at hand, let's have a general look at McIntyre, Clement, Dornay, and Knowles' willingness to communicate model from 1998, which consists of a pyramidal-shaped structure with many layers. First, it is important to consider that McIntyre views willingness to communicate as a readiness to enter into discourse at a particular time with a specific person or persons using a L2. Also, according to him, all social, affective, cognitive, and situational variables influence one's willingness to communicate in the foreign language. But what was the objective of the model? It was to put across that the most important goal of language pedagogy is to create willingness to communicate within individuals.
Now we're going to take a closer look at each layer by themselves. The first layer corresponds to communication behavior, which translates to L2 use and can be regarded as the result of a complex system of interrelated variables. Examples: speaking up in class, reading an L2 newspaper, watching L2 television, or using the L2 at work. In short, it refers to using the L2. Next, let's look into behavioral intention. Here we have willingness to communicate in itself, which, as we already mentioned, McIntyre defined as readiness to enter discourse at a particular time with a specific person or persons using a L2. Consider the next example. If a teacher asks his or her students a question and then the students raise their hands to answer the question, they expressed willingness to communicate in L2. In other words, it is the intention to communicate if he or she is given the opportunity to do so.
Now, there are two different types of situated antecedents of communication. These are: first, the desire to communicate with a specific person and state communicative self-confidence, which is a momentary feeling of confidence and, in other words, corresponds to a feeling able to effectively communicate in L2. The next layer corresponds to motivational propensities, and its first component is interpersonal motivation, which stem from the social roles that one adopts in his or her group. The second component is intergroup motivation, which originates from one's sense of belonging to a specific social group. The last component is L2 confidence, which is based on the affective and cognitive context. They eventually lead to a state of self-confidence and a desire to speak with a particular person.
The fifth layer corresponds to affective and cognitive context. It is composed by, firstly, intergroup attitudes, which denote L2 students' desire to be in contact with L2 community and the feeling enjoyment that one feels while learning a language. It also contains social situation, which includes variables such as the participants, setting, purpose, topic, channel of communication, and the interlocutor proficiency level. Lastly, It is composed of communicative competence, which refers to one's level of proficiency, which can significantly affect one's degree of willingness to communicate. To finish this section, we have the societal and individual context, which addresses intergroup climate. It corresponds to one's attitudes towards the L2 community, the value that one attaches to it, and the desire that one must adapt and reduce social distance between the L1 and L2 communities. On the other hand, personality has an indirect impact on willingness to communicate through variables as attitude, motivation, and confidence.
Now we're going to appraise if you could catch some very implicit bits of information regarding the model. The first three layers have something in common. What is it? Strictly speaking, what they have in common is that they all exert situational influences on L2 communication. In plain English, this means that they employ influences dependent on the specific context in which a person functions at a given time. Think about it for a second. We have the next examples: desire to speak to a specific person and knowledge of topic. Are these influences situational or stable? Then, what about the bottom three layers? The bottom layers represent relatively stable, enduring influences on the process of L2 communication. Did you guess right? As a bit of extra information, according to McIntyre and Ishima, they function as a foundation of the pyramid on which the first three layers interact with each other, as well as the latter layers in influencing L2 communication. Now let's move on to antecedents. According to McCroskey and Richmond's work in 2007, there are other variables that lead to differences in the degree of willingness to communicate among individuals. These variables are the antecedents.
The first is communication apprehension, which refers to anxiety towards real or anticipated communication with another person in a foreign language. To Horwitz et al. 1986 work, communication apprehension is the anxiety that one feels when he or she communicates in his or her foreign language. The next is self-perceived communication competence, which according to McCroskey 1982 study refers to one's evaluation of his or her ability to communicate appropriately in a particular situation. In their 2007 work, Liu conclude that learners who feel more competent in communication are more confident in interacting with others, hence more willing to communicate.
The third variable is motivation, which was shown to be related to the willingness to communication in Hashimoto's 2002 study. In it, it was proved that the students who have greater motivation to learn the language are more interested to use the language in the classroom. Also, in Yashima's 2002 study, results demonstrated that motivation has an impact on self-confidence in L2 communication, which in turn increases willingness to communicate in L2. Having in mind anxiety and motivation, let's go back to what we learned with the visual organizer assessments, or more specifically, to Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis. This was composed of 5 small hypotheses, and one of them talked about a filter. Do you remember its name? It is the affective filter hypothesis, which according to Krashen 1986 work, suggests that there is a mental block that prevents learners from providing a comprehensible output. How can we relate to motivation and anxiety to this mental block? Krashen states that this mental block is most probable to happen when we have low self-esteem, low motivation, and high anxiety or stress. So, could this mental block also affect willingness to communicate?
The fourth antecedent is personality, and it is an important factor that determines one's degree of willingness to communicate, as according to Sun's 2008 work, it was found that extrovert students have a higher perception of their communication competence. Also in 2008, Chu found a negative correlation between individuals' shyness and their degree of willingness to communicate too. Next, content and context. They are a factor affecting willingness to communicate, as Kang concluded in his work in 2005 that learners feel more secure when talking to somebody whom they are familiar with, and that learners feel less secure when their interlocutor is more fluent than them. He also discovered that participants felt more eager if the topic was more familiar to them.
The last variables are gender and age, as in 2004 Donovan and McIntyre proved how willingness to communicate varies according to sex and age. Findings showed that as males age, their willingness to communicate increases. Females, in contrast, become less willing to communicate with age. The investigation was then revisited and confirmed by Liu in 2007. Now, let's move on to willingness to participate. According to Bernales' 2015 work, McIntyre model did not consider the instance in which students have the desire to speak, but prefer to remain silent due to other considerations, such as a sense of solidarity toward peers who have fewer opportunities to use the L2, the time that it takes learners to produce an answer, etc. She also states that the model omits other forms of participation, such as the formulation of thoughts in students' minds that are not intended for articulation. In other words, it does not consider willingness to participate.
For the final discussion, we are going to ask another three questions. Do you agree with Catalina Bernales' ideas? Have you ever felt the desire to speak but decided to remain silent? Why? In your opinion, is McIntyre's model accurate? Needs to be revisited or is plainly wrong?